newly appointed Society historian, Mr. Spencer Dayton, to offer the immortal memory. Please welcome Spencer.
All right, let's turn into Spill here. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. So, for those who don't know me, as Kenny said, I'm Spencer, our Society's new historian. We wanted to get more involved with the Society this year. The first opportunity that came up was tonight's dinner. And Kenny graciously accepted it and said, why not do the immortal memory? And I said, okay. And then I spent the next few weeks writing this thing and torturing my wife with all the different versions. I want to warn you though, because once again, some of you may not know me, but I come from the world of professional politics, so giving me a microphone is dangerous. I promise not to take up too much of your time. Too much of your time. I did, yeah. I promise not to take up too much of your time tonight, though, especially since I just scrapped all my Abe Lincoln jokes since everyone stopped. But I want to talk a little bit about what Burns means to me tonight, illustrated with some lines from the man himself, which is more meaningful than anything I could ever write or say. You know, we have other poets, other writer heroes, yet none are afforded the veneration we give to Robert Burns. The English have Shakespeare. The Irish have Joyce. As Americans, we have Longfellow. And the Germans have Goethe. All are internationally known and respected, yet none have an evening in their honor. There's no Shakespeare suppers. There's no Joyce junkets. When our Burns supper is finishing tonight, there still may be a few others across the world still going. Around the world and around the clock on January 25th, or near to it like tonight, there's not an hour in the day when there's not a Burns supper taking place somewhere. Such is the demand that we have to go to adjacent nights because hotels, church halls, and other places cannot cope with the demands. A lot has been said about Burns, but I rather like the trenchant comment by another Scottish writer, the late great Hugh MacDiarmid. He once said, "Mere nonsense has been uttered in the name of Robert Burns, then only's barren liberty in Christ." This seems to me to be a good way of describing what has been done to Burns' reputation over the last 200 years. He's often described as a sort of 18th century rock star, always heroically drunk, chasing the ladies, and managing to turn out amazing riffs of poetry, perform it in public, and then dying young due to all of this excess. The truth rarely gets in the way of the legend. But a Mr. Findlater, who was Burns' superior officer in the Excise, wrote only a few years after his death, "Succeeding commentators have, by aid of their own fancies, amplified, exaggerated, and filled up the outlines he has sketched." Findlater dispelled a number of his myths surrounding Burns, particularly the one about him being a prodigious drinker. Robert Burns was born in Alloway, Ayrshire on the 25th of January in 1759, and he died in Dumfries on the 21st of July, 1796. We celebrate his birth. We don't mark his death. Burns' work is all about life and living. It celebrates the common man. But in those short 37 years, he left a huge impact on this world. His family were farmers, making a living on 70 acres. But when he was 6, his father, whose name was William, and some of the neighbors established a village school and hired a teacher, a Mr. Murdoch, for all their families to start to learn. Robert and his brother Gilbert attended that school. However, the teacher had left by 1768, near 2 years later. They left the boy's father to continue their education. However, there is evidence that from Burns' later writing that he had read widely and that he had a knowledge of Latin. He was a very literate farm boy. However, he had to work like a Trojan to help his father on the farm, something which weakened his health and eventually led to an early death. During the harvest of 1774, he was assisted by a young lass named Nellie Kirkpatrick. She inspired his first attempt at poetry, "Oh, I Once Loved a Bonny Lass." In the summer of 1775, he was sent to finish his education with a tutor in nearby Kirkoswald, where he met Peggy Thompson, to whom he wrote 2 songs, "Now Whistling Winds" and "I Dreamed I'd Lay." In 1780, at the age of 21, Robert and his brother Gilbert, with other young lads of Tarbleton, founded the Tarbleton Bachelors Club, setting an example followed by many Burns clubs around the world to this day. It was founded as, and I quote, a diversion to relieve the wearied man worn down by necessary labors of life. Robert was elected their first president. His father had died by 1784, and with his brother Gilbert, the poet rented a farm, but this venture, like many others in their life, was unsuccessful. In 1785, his first child, a girl, was born to his mother's serving girl, Betty Patton, and that same year he met Jean Armour. He had an intimate affair with Jean Armour, for which he was censured by the Kirk and had to spend time on the cuddy stool in front of the entire church, labeled as a fornicator. As a result of his farming misfortunes and attempts by Jean's father to overthrow their common law marriage, he decided to immigrate. He took a job as an overseer on a Jamaican plantation. But in order to raise money for this, he published a volume of poems which he had been completing for some years. This is the very famous Kilmarnock edition of 1786. At the same time, he fell in love with another woman from a Highland family named Mary Campbell. Many of you may remember she's known as Highland Mary because of her association with Burns to this day. He sent her to Greenock to wait for him while he published this edition, and he would send for her when it was time to leave for the West Indies. This volume of poetry was so unexpectedly successful that instead of sailing to the West Indies, he went to Edinburgh. And during that winter, he was the chief literary celebrity of the season, being lionized by the nobility in Scotland. Another enlarged edition of his poems was published in 1787, and money helped him to aid in his brother's farm, and he decided to make stock of himself and buy another farm for himself next door in Ellisland. But what about Highland Mary? Well, he left her in Greenock where she caught typhoid and died in 1786. His fame as a poet had reconciled his connection to the Armours, however, and having now regularly married Jean, he brought her to Ellisland and once more tried farming. It lasted 3 years. He published several more poetry editions and put words to many Scots tunes in the Scots Musical Museum and George Thompson's selection of the original Scottish airs. Many of these tunes would be lost if it were not for his work. In spite of the fact that he was always broke, he refused to accept any payment for his work, preferring to regard it as a patriotic service. And it was, for which we are still grateful to this day. His productions still enshrine the lives of Scots and lovers of poetry everywhere. He gave up on his farm in Ellisland in 1792, and he was appointed an exciseman in Dumfries, which did help a little bit with his money problems. But by then he was thoroughly discouraged, and he saw his work as a mere drudgery. And his tendency to take a relaxation in debauchery weakened his constitution. Burns tried another venture, joining the army, becoming a private in the Royal Dumfries Volunteers for the last 1.5 years of his life. However, he seemed very practical about this, stating in one verse, "Oh, why the deuce should I repine and be an ill forebodder? I'm 23 and 5'9". I'll go and be a soldier." But by doing so, Burns had enlisted into the Scottish military tradition only a few decades after the Jacobite rebellions. It was a busy time of regiment building due to the invasion threats from France. We can see in his work that Burns was initially seduced by the strains of liberty coming out of those French revolutions. But then he ended up switching sides and composed a series of much more patriotic verses, which could be much more suitable for a pillar of the community like an exciseman. From January to March of 1796, there was a famine in Dumfries, and by July he was in his last illness. On July 21st, all but destitute and in debt, Burns died. He was buried with full military honors on the 25th of July, and his son Maxwell was born of Jean Armour that same day. During his life, Raby was a humorist, a satirist, a storyteller, a lover, a socialist, a nationalist, and a philosopher. He could be romantic and charming. He could be funny and sarcastic, and he definitely had a devastating wit. His life and work was and is a series of contradictions, a personal response to the turmoil and change in Scotland. The agrarian and industrial revolution were changing the country. The population was increasing, leaving land for the cities and immigrating. Scotland was becoming part of Britain after the Jacobite rebellions, and the French Revolution was shaping the politics of Europe. Given all this stress, it is perhaps not surprising that Burns himself was full of contradictions. At times he was a lover. At many others he was a lecher. At times he was romantic. At others he was a realist. He was a nationalist but an internationalist. He was radical and a reactionary. Were Burns alive today, the media would have a good time taking him to task over all these contradictions. But I like to think he'd cope, turning up on the BBC to debate with Joe Coburn and other journalists. And if he penned the political verse, his barbs today would just be likely aimed at Nicola Sturgeon as well as Rishi Sunak. Through all of his work, Burns disarms us with his honesty and self-knowledge. He expressed it beautifully in his first epistle to John Maverick. I win a blow about myself, as ill I like my faults to tell. But friends and folk that wish me well, they sometimes ruse me. Though I'm on my own, as money still, as far abuse me. There's a wee fault they weasely blame to me. I like the lassies, God forgave me. When I think of Burns, I think of a man's ability to paint beautiful pictures with words, with a rich, expressive use of language, colloquial and classical. He could show great wisdom for such a young man, much more than your today's average rock star. And although Burns often wrote in the Lowland Scots, which is difficult for non-Scots like my wife during this speech to follow, he was a poet of the English language, writing at the start of a period in which English has taken over the world. That's another reason for his enduring success over the last 2 centuries. Only Shakespeare's Henry V can compare with the emotion conveyed in a speech to troops before a battle that Burns conjured up in Scots Wha Hae, a song about the Battle of Bannockburn. What will be a traitor knave? What will fill a coward's grave? What say base as be a slave? Let him turn and flee. Wait for Scotland's king and law, freedom's sword will strongly draw. Freemen stand or freemen fall, let him on we be. As a storyteller poet, Burns has few peers. Is there a better ghost story than Tam O'Shanter? He painted word pictures. Listen to these words as describing a cozy seat in a warm bar with good friends on a stormy night from a cotter's Saturday night. A market night, Tam got planted unco, right fast by an ingle blazing, Finley with serene and swats that drank divinely at his elbow. Souter Johnny, his ancient trusty dougherty crony, Tam load him like a brother. They had been for 4 weeks together. Burns is one of the many reasons why I'm proud to be a Scot, with the very massive complex contradictions that goes into that identity. We normally like to keep it hidden beneath sober, dour exteriors, pretending to be respectable in our jobs as bank managers, ships engineers, or whatever. But we all like to think that we have a bit of the poet's soul inside us, a hidden romantic side. And Burns helps us to express that and let it out from time to time, like tonight. Every new year, the world starts off by rejoicing in the world words rescued and reworked by Burns. There's no better memorial to the man than the words of Auld Lang Syne. Such energy, such dazzling brilliance, a mastery of his own intricate indigenous stanzas, or rather stanza forms that he made his own. Being such a virtuoso with a range of tones and registers from high English to richly relished demonic, a heady mix and bringing it all off superbly in the end. Now none but a parodist dare essay the Burns stanzas. I'm very proud to give you all this toast, the proudest for any Scot to propose. It's a toast for which we should drink with joy and with pride, with reverence and irreverence in equal measure. So I ask you all, Scot or not, to charge your glasses, stand and raise them high, as I give you all the immortal memory of Robert Burns.